She acted as a billionaire fiancé to satisfy his mom, but now he wants a real wedding. Sophia's hands trembled as she stared at the pregnancy test in her cramped studio apartment bathroom. 2 pink lines. Positive. The fake engagement ring on her finger suddenly felt heavier than ever, because the man who put it there, billionaire Liam Crawford, didn't know that their carefully orchestrated lie had just become the most complicated truth of her life. But here's the twist that will shock you. Liam had been hiding an even bigger secret, one that would change everything they thought they knew about their arrangement. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button because you won't want to miss what happens next. Enjoy the story. 3 months earlier, Sofia Martinez was living paycheck to paycheck in Seattle, working double shifts at an upscale restaurant while auditioning for roles that never seemed to materialize. Her acting career was stalling, her rent was overdue, and her mother's medical bills were piling up like autumn leaves after her recent diagnosis with rheumatoid arthritis. Every morning, Sofia would check her bank account and feel that familiar knot in her stomach as she calculated how many days she could survive on what little remained. She'd moved to Seattle with dreams of making it on stage, but 3 years later, those dreams felt more like distant memories she could no longer afford to chase. The restaurant where she worked, Le Bernardin, was the kind of place where tech moguls and business tycoons came to seal million-dollar deals over $30 steaks. Sofia had become invisible to most of them, just another pretty face serving overpriced wine to people who wouldn't notice if their meal cost more than she made in a week. But she was good at her job, professional and warm without being intrusive, which is probably why she'd managed to keep it, despite the constant stress of her financial situation. That's when the most unusual job offer of her life walked through the restaurant's glass doors. Liam Crawford wasn't just any customer. At 28, he was the youngest CEO in his family's empire, Crawford Industries, a conglomerate that owned everything from hotels to tech companies to half the real estate in downtown Seattle. Worth more money than most people could count, he was the kind of man who appeared on Forbes covers and had his dating life dissected in gossip magazines. Tall, devastatingly handsome, with dark hair that always looked perfectly tousled and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through people, he commanded attention wherever he went. But that night, as Sofia served him his usual black coffee, she noticed something different. He looked tired, almost defeated, which seemed impossible for someone who owned half of downtown Seattle and had never heard the word no in a business meeting. "Rough day?" Sofia asked, refilling his cup. She'd served him dozens of times over the past few months, and while their interactions were always polite, tonight felt different. Usually, he was glued to his phone, conducting business, even during his brief dinner breaks. Tonight, he sat staring out the window at the Seattle skyline like he was seeing it for the first time. Liam looked up at her, really looked at her for the first time. She had warm brown eyes that seemed genuinely concerned, not the practiced sympathy of someone hoping for a bigger tip. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she had the kind of natural beauty that didn't need enhancement, which was probably why he'd never really noticed her before tonight. She seemed real in a world full of people trying to be something they weren't. "You could say that. My mother just gave me an ultimatum." He paused, studying Sofia's face, noting how she didn't immediately ask what kind of ultimatum or pry for details like most people would have. "This might sound crazy, but what would you say if I offered you $50,000 for 3 months of work?" Sofia's heart nearly stopped. $50,000 would cover her mother's treatments, her rent for the next year, and give her the financial freedom to focus on her acting career without the constant panic of wondering where her next meal would come from. But growing up in a small town had taught her that nothing came free, especially not from billionaires. "What kind of work?" she asked cautiously, setting the coffee pot down and crossing her arms. "Be my fiancé." Fake, of course. My mother is convinced I'm going to die alone and leave no heir to the Crawford legacy. She's threatened to remove me as CEO unless I'm married by my 30th birthday, which is in 6 months. I need someone to convince her I'm capable of commitment, just long enough for her to back off and stop interfering in my personal life. The offer was insane, but Sofia's desperation made it sound like salvation. She'd seen enough rom-coms to know how these arrangements usually ended, but this wasn't a movie. This was her life, and she was drowning. Why me? You could have any woman in Seattle, actresses, models, socialites who actually belong in your world. Because you're real, Liam said simply, his voice taking on a sincerity she hadn't expected. You're not from my world, which means my mother will believe I actually fell for someone instead of making a calculated business decision. You're beautiful, intelligent, and you have this way of making people feel comfortable. I've watched you with the other customers. Plus you need the money and I need authenticity. It's a perfect business arrangement. Within a week, Sophia found herself signing a contract thicker than most novels, each page detailing expectations, boundaries, and contingencies she'd never imagined needing. She moved into Liam's penthouse, a stunning space on the 40th floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay, where her entire studio apartment could have fit into just his walk-in closet. She learned to navigate a world where her shoes cost more than she used to make in a month, where personal shoppers and stylists became part of her daily routine, and where she had to memorize the names and backgrounds of dozens of Seattle's elite who would undoubtedly scrutinize every aspect of her relationship with Liam. The rules were simple but detailed. Be affectionate in public, attend all family and social functions, sell the relationship to Liam's mother, Margaret Crawford, learn enough about Liam's business and interests to appear genuinely invested, maintain separate bedrooms to keep boundaries clear, and absolutely no real feelings. The last rule was underlined 3 times in the contract and discussed extensively during their initial meetings. This was business, pure and simple. Margaret Crawford was exactly what Sophia expected from a billionaire matriarch, elegant in that effortless way that comes from a lifetime of privilege, sharp enough to have co-built the Crawford empire alongside her late husband, and intimidating in the way that only women who've commanded boardrooms for decades can be. Her silver hair was always perfectly styled, her posture spoke of old money and older values, and her piercing blue eyes, identical to Liam's, seemed to catalogue every detail for future reference. But she was also lonely, having lost her husband Robert 5 years earlier to a sudden heart attack, and desperately wanted to see her only child happy. From their first meeting at the Crawford family estate in Bellevue, Margaret embraced Sophia with a warmth that made the deception feel like a betrayal of the worst kind. "Finally, someone who can make my son smile," Margaret said, squeezing Sophia's hands during their first family dinner. "I was beginning to think he'd forgotten how." The first month was awkward but manageable, like learning to dance with someone whose steps you didn't know. Liam was surprisingly easy to live with. He was gone most days running his empire, often leaving before dawn for meetings and returning after sunset with briefcases full of documents that represented millions of dollars in decisions. When he was home, he was respectful of boundaries, almost to a fault. He knocked before entering shared spaces, always asked if she needed anything before disappearing into his home office, and maintained a polite distance that felt more like roommates than fake fiancés. They developed a comfortable routine that felt oddly domestic. Breakfast together where they'd discuss the day's schedule and any appearances that required them to play the loving couple. Afternoons spent learning about each other's backgrounds and interests so they could convincingly answer questions about their relationship, and quiet evenings where they'd retreat to their separate bedrooms after sharing dinner and a glass of wine while watching the sunset over the Sound. But somewhere between charity galas where they had to hold hands and smile for photographers, and intimate family dinners where Margaret would tell embarrassing stories about Liam's childhood, while he rolled his eyes and squeezed Sophia's hand in mock mortification, the lines began to blur. Sophia found herself looking forward to Liam's rare, genuine smiles, not the practiced ones he wore for board meetings, but the ones that crinkled the corners of his eyes when he was truly amused. She began to notice the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his work, particularly the Crawford Foundation's charitable initiatives. She saw how gentle he was with his mother, despite their complicated relationship, and how he remembered small details about everyone from his doorman to his executive assistant's children. Liam, meanwhile, began to notice things about Sophia that hadn't been covered in their initial interviews. How she remembered everyone's names at events, from the valet to the mayor's wife, and ask thoughtful follow-up questions about their families and interests. How she could make him laugh, even after his most stressful days, with her spot-on impressions of particularly pompous board members. How she never seemed impressed by his wealth, but was genuinely interested in his thoughts and opinions on everything from city planning to his favorite books. The turning point came during their second month together, during what should have been a routine weekend at the Crawford family's lake house in the San Juan Islands. Margaret had planned it as a relaxing getaway, but it was also the first time Sophia and Liam had to share a bedroom for an entire weekend. The lake house was beautiful, but intimate, with guest rooms that hadn't been updated since Liam's childhood, which meant one bed and very little privacy. They'd worked out a system of taking turns, changing in the bathroom and maintaining careful distance, but that first night, lying in the dark on opposite sides of the king-size bed with what felt like an ocean of space between them, Sophia heard Liam's phone buzz with a late-night call. She pretended to be asleep as he slipped out onto the deck to take it, but his voice carried through the thin walls. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," he whispered into the darkness, his voice breaking in a way she'd never heard before. "I'm 30 years old and I've never had a real relationship. I don't even know if I'm capable of love or if I'm just too damaged by this lifestyle to connect with anyone authentically. Everyone wants something from me, money, connections, status. I can't tell what's real anymore." There was a long pause, and Sophia found herself holding her breath. "She's different, though," Liam continued, and Sophia's heart started racing, wondering if he was talking about her. "When she looks at me, I don't see dollar signs in her eyes. She argues with me about books. She calls me out when I'm being pretentious, and she makes me feel like maybe I'm not just a bank account in an expensive suit. But it's fake, and she's being paid to be here, so how can I trust any of it?" Sophia's heart ached for him as she realized that beneath the billionaire exterior was someone just as lonely and scared as she was. Someone who'd been surrounded by people his entire life, but had never felt truly known by any of them. The next morning, she took his hand as they walked along the lake shore, not for show because Margaret was still sleeping, but because she wanted to comfort him, to let him know that someone saw past the money and the expectations to the man underneath. "You're not damaged," she said softly. "You're just careful. There's a difference." That's when everything changed between them. The touches lingered longer. The kisses for show became more tender. They started talking late into the night about their real hopes and fears. Sophia shared stories about her childhood in a small town, her dreams of making it as an actress, and her fear of never being enough. Liam opened up about the pressure of living up to his family's legacy, the loneliness of his position, and how he'd never felt truly known by anyone. They were falling in love, but neither wanted to admit it, because it would complicate everything. Then Margaret announced she wanted to plan their wedding for Christmas, just 2 weeks after their contract was supposed to end. "I've already booked the cathedral and called the florist," she said excitedly. "It'll be the wedding of the century." That night, Liam paced his office like a caged animal. "We have to tell her the truth," he said. "This has gone too far." But Sophia couldn't bear the thought of breaking Margaret's heart. "What if we just extended the contract, got married for real but kept it business?" "Marriage isn't a business transaction, Sophia." Liam's voice was strained. "At least it shouldn't be." "Then what do you want it to be?" she asked, her heart hammering. He looked at her with such intensity that she felt it in her bones. "I want it to be real. I want you to be real, but I don't know if you're here because you care about me or because I'm paying you." The question hung between them like a wall, and neither knew how to tear it down. That's when Sophia discovered she was pregnant. Staring at those 2 pink lines in the marble bathroom of their penthouse, she felt like her entire world had shifted on its axis. She'd been so careful about everything else in their arrangement, but somehow the most important thing had slipped through the cracks of their carefully constructed boundaries. The fake engagement ring on her finger, a stunning 3-carat diamond that had probably cost more than most people's cars, suddenly felt heavier than ever because the man who put it there, billionaire Liam Crawford, didn't know that their carefully orchestrated lie had just become the most complicated truth of either of their lives. Her hands were shaking, as she tried to process what this meant. The contract had contingencies for almost everything. What happened if they were photographed by paparazzi? What happened if Margaret suspected the truth? What happened if either of them wanted to end the arrangement early? But nowhere in those thick legal documents was there a clause for what happens if the fake fiancé gets pregnant with the fake fiancé's very real baby. But the real shock came when she decided to tell Liam immediately, needing to share this earth-shattering news with the only other person who would understand the full complexity of their situation. She walked into his glass-walled home office to find him on the phone with someone, his usually controlled voice urgent and scared, in a way that made her stomach clench with dread. "The doctors say she has maybe 6 months left," he was saying, running his hands through his hair in the gesture she'd learned meant he was at his breaking point. "The treatments aren't working anymore, and she's getting weaker every day. I don't know how to tell Sophia. Margaret has become like a mother to her, and she has no idea how sick she really is. How do I tell someone that the woman who's been planning our wedding with such joy is dying?" Sophia's blood ran cold. Margaret was dying, and Liam had been hiding it this entire time. When he saw her in the doorway, his face went white. "Sophia, I can explain." "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Since before I hired you." He set down the phone, his shoulders sagging. "The ultimatum about marriage wasn't about the company succession. She's dying of cancer, and her dying wish is to see me settled and happy. I couldn't bear to tell you because I knew it would change everything about why you stayed." Sophia felt like the world was spinning. "So this was never about business? You hired me to give your dying mother peace of mind?" "I hired you because I was desperate to give the woman who raised me the one thing she wanted before she died. But I fell in love with you because of who you are." His voice broke. "I fell in love with your kindness, your strength, the way you light up a room. I fell in love with how you've loved my mother like she was your own." Tears were streaming down Sophia's face as she processed everything. "I'm pregnant," she said quietly. Liam's entire world seemed to stop. "What?" "I found out 20 minutes ago. I came here to tell you, and instead I find out that everything I thought I knew about our situation was wrong." She was sobbing now. "Margaret is dying, and I'm having your baby, and I don't know what's real anymore." Liam crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. "This is real," he said fiercely. "You and me, right now, this is the most real thing in my life. I love you, Sophia. Not because of any contract or arrangement, but because you've made me believe in love again." "I love you too," she whispered against his chest. "But what do we do now?" "We tell my mother the truth," Liam said, "about everything. About how we met, about why I hired you, and about the baby. She deserves to know that she's going to be a grandmother." That evening they sat in Margaret's sunroom, her frail hands wrapped around a cup of tea as they explained everything. Sophia was terrified that Margaret would feel betrayed, but the older woman just smiled. "Do you think I'm stupid?" Margaret asked gently. "I knew from the beginning that something wasn't quite right about your relationship. The timing was too convenient, and Liam had never mentioned you before suddenly showing up engaged." Sophia's heart sank. "You knew it was fake?" "I knew it started fake," Margaret corrected. "But I watched it become real. I watched my son come alive in a way I'd never seen before. I watched you love him not because of his money or status, but despite it. I watched you both fight your feelings because you thought they would complicate your arrangement." She reached for both their hands. "Love isn't complicated, darlings. People make it complicated." "Mum," Liam's voice was thick with emotion, "I know about the cancer. I'm so sorry I didn't tell you that I knew." Margaret squeezed his hand. "I didn't tell you because I wanted you to choose love for yourself, not as a dying woman's wish, but knowing that I'll get to hold my grandchild, even briefly, is more than I ever dared hope for." The wedding happened 2 weeks later, but it was nothing like the elaborate cathedral ceremony Margaret had originally planned. Instead, it was an intimate gathering in the same sunroom where they'd shared the truth, with just Margaret, Sophia's mother, who flew in from California despite her own health struggles, Liam's childhood best friend who served as best man, Sophia's college roommate as maid of honor, and a handful of close family friends who had watched the Crawford family through decades of joy and sorrow. The room was filled with white roses and soft candlelight, creating an atmosphere that was both elegant and deeply personal. Margaret sat in her favorite chair, wrapped in a cashmere shawl but glowing with happiness, despite her obvious frailness. She'd insisted on helping Sophia get ready, brushing her hair with gentle strokes while sharing stories about her own wedding day 40 years earlier. Sophia wore a simple white dress that accommodated her barely showing pregnancy, a flowing A-line design that Margaret had helped her choose from a boutique that specialized in non-traditional wedding gowns. It was beautiful without being ostentatious, romantic without being overly formal, exactly the kind of dress that suited a wedding born from unexpected love rather than social obligation. Liam couldn't stop crying during his vows, his voice breaking as he struggled to find words for everything he was feeling. "You saved me," he told her, his hands trembling as he held hers, not just from loneliness or family pressure, but from a life without purpose. "When I hired you, I thought I was buying a solution to my problems. Instead, you taught me that love isn't something you hire or arrange or schedule in your calendar between board meetings. It's something you choose every day, even when it's scary, even when it means your perfectly ordered world gets turned upside down." Sophia's own vows were equally emotional. "I came into your life for money," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I stayed for love. You showed me that I was worthy of being chosen, not just hired, that my dreams mattered, that my opinions had value, that love doesn't have to be earned. It can simply be given freely and received gratefully." Margaret passed away 4 months later, on a quiet spring morning when the cherry blossoms were in full bloom outside her bedroom window. She died holding Sophia's hand, as their daughter kicked strongly in her belly. Her final words a whispered, "Thank you for giving him love and for giving me hope." It was peaceful, surrounded by the two people who had become her whole world, with sunlight streaming through the windows and the sound of birds singing in the garden she'd tended for decades. The funeral was a celebration of her life, rather than a mourning of her death, exactly as she'd requested. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects: business associates, charity board members, family friends, and countless individuals whose lives Margaret had touched through her philanthropic work. But the moment that broke everyone's heart was when Liam delivered the eulogy, talking about how his mother had taught him that the greatest legacy isn't money or power, but the love you give and the lives you change. Their daughter, Margaret Rose Crawford, was born 6 months after the wedding, arriving 2 weeks early on a snowy December morning that transformed the world into a winter wonderland. She came into the world with her father's piercing blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit, and from her first breath she seemed to fill the spaces in their hearts they hadn't even known were empty. As Sophia watched her husband hold their daughter for the first time, singing the same lullaby his mother had sung to him when he was scared or sad, she realized that sometimes the most beautiful love stories start with the most unlikely arrangements. The money that had originally brought them together had long since been returned to Liam, deposited back into his account the week after Margaret's funeral, because Sophia had realized that what they'd built was worth infinitely more than any contract could define. They'd started as strangers with a business arrangement, two people trying to solve practical problems with practical solutions, but they'd become partners in the truest sense, two people who chose each other not because they had to, but because they couldn't imagine their lives any other way. Today, 5 years later, they run the Crawford Foundation together, focusing on medical research for cancer and arthritis, and supporting struggling artists who need financial help to pursue their dreams. The foundation has funded dozens of scholarships, supported groundbreaking research that has led to new treatment options, and created programs that give aspiring actors and artists the kind of opportunities Sophia had once dreamed of. Sophia never did make it as a famous actress, but she found her true calling helping others achieve their dreams, using her own story as proof that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the most fulfilling destinations. Liam, who once thought he was incapable of love, learned that love isn't about being perfect or having all the answers or maintaining control over every aspect of your life. It's about showing up authentically, being honest even when it's uncomfortable, and choosing each other again and again through both joy and sorrow. He discovered that the greatest success isn't measured in profit margins or stock prices, but in the depth of connection you build with the people who matter most. They have 2 children now, Margaret Rose, who's 5, and already showing signs of her grandmother's determination and her parents' compassion, and James Robert, named after Liam's father, who's 3 and has inherited his mother's warm smile and his father's curious mind. Their house is filled with the beautiful chaos of family life. Toys scattered across marble floors, fingerprints on windows that once showcased only perfect views, and the sound of children's laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent for too many years. Every year on their anniversary, they return to Margaret's sunroom, now part of their home since they bought the family estate, and they read the vows they wrote for each other, not the ones they spoke at their wedding, but new ones they write each year, reflecting on how their love has grown and changed. This year, Sophia wrote, "I chose you when I thought it was just business. I choose you now because you're my best friend, my partner, and the person who sees all of me and loves me anyway." Liam's vows this year read, "5 years ago I hired you to be my fake fiancé. Today I choose you as my real partner, my co-parent, my best friend, and the love of my life. Thank you for teaching me that the best things in life can't be bought or negotiated. They can only be chosen, nurtured, and treasured." Their story reminds us that sometimes the most genuine connections come from the most unexpected places, and that real love has a way of growing even in the most artificial circumstances. It teaches us that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about the people who choose to love us, support us, and walk through life beside us through every season of joy and challenge. Most importantly, it shows us that authenticity and vulnerability, even in the midst of complicated circumstances, can transform any relationship from something transactional into something transformational. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever found love in an unexpected place? Do you believe that genuine feelings can grow from complicated beginnings? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that celebrate the beautiful messiness of human connection. Sometimes the best love stories are the ones that start with the most unlikely once upon a time.